My name is Alana Weiss, and I work on the leadership development team as part of Google University. And today it is my pleasure to welcome Tim Brown to the Authors at Google series. Tim Brown is the CEO and president of IDEO, a global design consultancy focused on creating impact through design. IDEO has won more industrial design excellence awards than any other firm and has been ranked in the top 25 most innovative companies in the world by Business Week. Tim is an industrial designer by training, and his own work has earned him numerous design awards and has been exhibited at MoMA in New York City, Axis Gallery in Tokyo, and the Design Museum in London. He has participated in the World Economic Forum and the TED Conference. Tim has led strategic client relationships with organizations such as Pepsi, Mayo Clinic, Procter & Gamble, and Steelcase. Many of us are here today because IDEO is a company that we really admire. Innovation is a core value that drives what we do here at Google, and who better to understand and also reflect that value than Tim? We're also lucky here today because we're among the first to hear about his new book, hot off the presses last week, Change by Design: How Design Thinking Transforms Organizations and Inspires Innovation. Please join me in welcoming Tim Brown.
Okay, well, thank you. It's great to be here. It really is great to be here. So I'm going to talk for maybe 25 minutes or so on what happens when we move from design to design thinking. I'm going to start off with a bit of autobiography, and this rather lousy image is actually the first thing that I ever was hired to design professionally. I wasn't even out of design school yet, actually. And it's a woodworking machine, or at least it's a piece of a woodworking machine. And I was hired to make it a little bit easier to use, a little bit more attractive, so that this company could sell more spindle molders and wood saws and other machinery that many of you may have used. I don't know. I think I did a pretty good job. In fact, if you happen to be on your vacation in England and happen to visit a woodworking shop somewhere in the north of England, as you may do, I don't know. I do often. You'll actually find these machines still being used today. Unfortunately, you won't find the company that makes them, because that went out of business actually quite soon after I'd done my project. The next project that I did is a fax machine. And again, I was hired to put an attractive shell around some what was then relatively new technology, and again, to make it a little bit more attractive and easy to use. This is actually one of those things that ended up in the design museums. But again, 18 months later, the product was obsolete, and of course now the whole technology is obsolete. My teenage daughters don't even know what faxing is. Many of you may not either. So it occurred to me that what passed for design maybe wasn't all that important. Making things a bit easier to use, making them a bit more attractive, making them a bit more marketable. By focusing on a design, I was being kind of incremental and not having very much impact. But I think this kind of small view of design is a relatively recent phenomena, and actually kind of emerged in the latter half of the 20th century as design became a tool of consumerism. So when we talk about design today, and particularly when we read about it in the popular press, we're often talking about products like these. Amusing, yep. Desirable, maybe. Important, not very. But this wasn't always the way. And I'd like to suggest that if we take a different view of design, and instead of focusing on the products, focus on design thinking as a process, then design perhaps ends up having a bigger impact. So again, this is a bit of a Brit-themed talk today. I apologize, but that's where I come from, as you may recognize from the accent. I know, does anybody recognize this guy? So these, not including the people who've already watched my TED talk. Okay, so this is, perhaps the 19th century equivalent of Larry Page and Sergey Brin. He wore more interesting clothing, I think, than they do. But this is Isambard Kingdom Brunel. And he was a truly great engineer and I think design thinker from the 19th century in Britain. And he built many firsts, including the Clifton Suspension Bridge, one of the first suspension bridges in Bristol, and the Thames Tunnel at Rotherhithe, one of the longest kind of underwater tunnels in the world. His most famous creation is in the south of England. I grew up very close to it, and it's called the Great Western Railway. And in fact, one of my favorite things to do as a kid was to ride my bicycle along the edge of the railway line, waiting for the big express trains to roar past, much to the consternation of my mother. You can see it represented here in J.M.W. Turner's painting, Rain, Steam and Speed. What was remarkable about Brunel when he built this railway was that he wasn't just thinking about how do I engineer a railway. He said that what he wanted to achieve for his passengers was the experience of floating across the countryside. It's a really great way of thinking about building a railway. And in order to do that, he had to create the flattest gradients that had ever yet been built. That meant long viaducts over river valleys. This one is actually over the River Thames at Maidenhead, and long tunnels like the one at Box in Wiltshire. But he didn't stop there. He didn't just stop with trying to make the best railway journey he could. He imagined an integrated transportation system where it was possible to get on a train in London and get off a ship in New York. One journey from London to New York. This is the SS Great Western that he built to take care of the second half of that journey, one of the first transatlantic steamships. So now, although this was a century before the emergence of design as a profession, I really think that Brunel was using design thinking to come up with great innovations and world-changing designs. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what that is. Design thinking starts with what Roger Martin, the University of Toronto Business School Dean, calls integrative thinking. This ability to hold opposing constraints in one's head and from that get to new solutions. In design, this means balancing desirability, what people need and want, with technical feasibility and economic viability. And with breakthrough designs like the Great Western Railway, we often stretch that balance to the very limit and sometimes break it. And I'm sure many of the things that you do the same thing. So somehow we went from this to this. We went from systems thinkers who were reinventing the world around us to a priesthood of folks in black turtlenecks and designer glasses working on small things. As design emerged as a profession, so it focused on a steadily smaller canvas until it came to stand for fashion, aesthetics, and style. And, you know, I have to admit, I'm a fully paid up member of that priesthood, and somewhere my jacket has my own pair of designer glasses in it. So I'm throwing stones at myself as well as my colleagues in the design industry. But I think design is getting big again. And I think that's happening through the application of design thinking to new kinds of problems. Things like climate change, healthcare, clean water, security, social welfare. And as we see this reemergence of design thinking as something that can have perhaps greater impact, then we can observe some basic ideas that design thinking kind of operates through, and we can perhaps learn from them. So what I'd like to do is talk about a few of those for the next few minutes and talk about some of the kinds of projects and problems that they're being applied to. So now design thinking starts with the idea of being human-centered. It may integrate the constraints of technology and economics, but it begins with what people need or might need, what makes life easier, more enjoyable, what makes technology useful and usable. But this is more than simply good ergonomics, putting the buttons in the right place, whether they're software buttons or hardware buttons. It's often about understanding culture and context before we even know where to start to have our ideas. So when a team was working in India on a new vision screening program, they wanted to understand what motivated and excited these kids to understand how they might play a role in screening their parents. Conversion Sound is a small startup actually based here in the Bay Area that's developed an ultra low-cost, very high-quality digital hearing aid for the developing markets. Now here in the West, these hearing aids are fitted by highly trained technicians. In places like India, those technicians simply don't exist. And so it took a team working with community health workers and patients to understand how a PDA application might replace technicians in the diagnosis and fitting service. But again, the team, instead of starting with technology, the team started with people and culture. And this idea of closely observing people can lead to recognizing behaviors that can ultimately lead to breakthrough innovations. So when a team was interested in studying families in the US to see how they managed their money, they saw two interesting behaviors. This is one of them, which is they saw people who were rounding up their utility bills when they paid them. And when they asked, well, why do you do that? The response was, well, I don't like to get behind. I don't like to feel like I owe the utility company money. And another behavior that they saw, which is one that I think many of us exhibit, was that when people went and paid for a cash transaction, they would take the coins that they got in exchange and change and take them home, stick them in a jar or somewhere, and then every so often take those to the bank or to give them to the kids to take to the bank and pay into their savings account. Again, when we asked them about this was this idea of sort of saving invisibly, saving without thinking about it. So that led to the idea of a new savings account for Bank of America called Keep the Change. I don't know if any of you use it. And what happens here is that when you go and pay for a transaction with your debit card, the payment gets rounded up to the nearest dollar and the change gets put into your savings account. So it takes this kind of behavior of automatic savings and staying ahead and applies it to, a very simple piece of technology to create a new kind of service. Again, it started with recognizing a behavior and led to an innovation. So if design thinking starts with the idea of being human-centered, and it moves quickly to learning by making things. Instead of thinking about what to build, we build in order to think. Because prototypes help us learn about our ideas. And the faster we put our prototypes out into the world, the faster we know about the qualities and strengths and weaknesses of our ideas, the faster we can evolve them, the faster we can improve them. Now, a lot has been said about the Aravindh eye clinic in Madurai, India. I'm sure many of you have heard of it. It manages to serve vast quantities of very poor patients by taking the revenues from those patients that can afford to pay and using them to cross-subsidize those who cannot. They're an incredibly efficient organization, but they're also very innovative. And the thing that I noticed when I visited was this willingness to prototype new ideas very quickly. So this is the manufacturing facility for one of their biggest cost breakthroughs. It's actually where they manufacture the intraocular lenses that they use to replace damaged lenses, our own lenses that are damaged by cataracts. And by doing this, they've brought the cost down from $200 a pair when they're made by Western producers to just $4 a pair. That's a huge, huge cost saving. And the way they did this was through a prototyping approach. Instead of building some fancy new factory, they put the facility in the basement of one of their hospitals. And instead of using the fancy large-scale machines that Western producers use, they use low-cost CAD/CAM prototyping technology to make the lenses. And they're now the biggest manufacturer of these lenses in the developing world. And actually, they've just recently moved into a custom factory. So if human need is the place to start and prototyping a vehicle for progress, then there are also questions to be asked about the destination. Instead of seeing consumption as its primary goal, design thinking is beginning to explore the idea and potential of participation. The shift from a passive relationship between consumer and producer to the active engagement of everyone in experiences that are meaningful, productive, and profitable. And clearly a lot of this capacity to explore more participative experiences has been driven by the web and many of the things that you all work on. Another Brit, my apologies. You're getting a great British history lesson today. When Sir William Beveridge created the first of his famous reports in 1942, he proposed what became Britain's welfare state, in which he hoped that every citizen would be an active participant in their own social welfare. By the time he wrote his third report, he confessed that he had failed, and instead created a society of welfare consumers. Hilary Cottam, Charlie Ledbetter, and Hugo Manasai of Participal in England have taken this idea of participation, and in their manifesto entitled Beveridge 4.0, they've described a model for reinventing the welfare state. One of their projects is this one. It's called Southwark Circle, in which a small team of designers worked with local residents in Southwark, South London, to develop a new membership organization that helps the elderly with household tasks. Ideas were developed and refined with 150 elderly people and their families before the service was launched earlier this year. And the service itself is a combination of kind of for-profit-like activities and volunteer activities. And it's really an idea about taking a lot of what currently is the responsibility of the healthcare providers and social welfare providers, kind of bringing it back out into the community where it can be done a lot less expensively and often to a higher quality. And I think that this idea of designing participatory systems where value over and above cash is both generated and measured isn't only going to be a major theme for design as we go forward, but perhaps a major theme for our economy as a whole. And we can take this idea of participation to its logical conclusion and say that perhaps the way that design can have its greatest impact is if we take it out of the hands of designers and put it into the hands of everyone. So a team of nurses and practitioners at Kaiser Permanente, a local organization, tackled the problem of improving the patient experience. And one thing they focused on was the exchange of knowledge between nurses. In particular, one particular project was how they changed shift. And so based on a process of observation, brainstorming new ideas, and rapid prototyping, the team developed a completely new way of changing shift. And instead of retreating to the nurses' station to share and tell each other about the various states and needs of patients, they developed a method for changing shift on the ward in front of patients using a simple software tool. The innovation brought the time that nurses are away from patients down from 40 minutes on average to just 12 minutes on average, increased patient confidence because now they know what's going on, and increased nurse happiness. And you multiply, that savings by every nurse on every shift, on every ward in the 35 hospitals that Kaiser have in their system, and that results in a lot more nursing time. And I think this is just one example of thousands of opportunities there are in healthcare alone to create innovations if we can get these kinds of processes into the hands of the people that are actually providing the service. Oops, sorry. But unfortunately, good ideas don't sell themselves. Any fans of Mad Men might recognize the image in the background. The 20th century saw the rise of an industry built to tell stories to encourage us to consume more, the advertising industry. And yet, when the goal is to create consumption but not participation, stories aren't sufficient. We need movements. One example of that, I think, is this one. It's not every day that you get the Prime Minister of a G8 country to launch your campaign. But that's exactly what a team, a Japanese creative agency, Hakuhodo, did when they launched this idea called CoolBiz. Have any of you heard of CoolBiz? It's a great idea. So this was the then Prime Minister Kozama of Japan. And the idea of CoolBiz was, in order to try and bring down the carbon footprint of Japan, they wanted to be able to lower or raise, I guess, the temperature settings on the air conditioning systems in offices during the summer. One of the biggest things that was preventing this was the formal dress that Japanese businessmen wear. You guys wouldn't have a problem with this, but all Japanese businessmen would turn up in a suit and tie all the way through the summer. And so the idea was that if we could persuade Japanese businessmen not to wear a tie, we could raise the temperature on the thermometers and save gigatons of carbon, or whatever it is. And so how do you persuade very conservative Japanese businessmen to stop wearing a tie? Well, the way they did it was they had a bunch of Japanese fashion designers design a whole range of new clothing, and then they had all of the CEOs and the Prime Minister of all the CEOs of the major corporations in Japan do a fashion show with all of this new clothing. So that was one thing they did. The second thing they did is as part of this campaign, they got these little badges, these little Cool Biz badges, and any company that signed up to the Cool Biz campaign, if you were wearing one of these badges, you simply couldn't tell somebody that they were wearing inappropriate dress at work. So now again, in California, we don't need badges for that, but in Japan, they needed badges for it. But this movement has ended up with thousands of companies in Japan signing up to the Cool Biz campaign, and you know, a lot of carbon being saved as a result. They have a similar program in the one of the other downsides, by the way, of having the temperature set so low in offices was that you just see most Japanese women who are also formally dressed in skirts and jackets in the offices with blankets over their knees because they were freezing cold. So it had another kind of comfort advantage benefit to women. And there's a similar program that goes on in the winter called Warm Biz. Same thing, wear a woolly sweater to work instead of, you know, and we can lower the setting on the thermostat. So an example of I think of going from the idea of just telling a story to creating a movement. In a similar vein, we've been working on a project recently for the national campaign against unwanted pregnancy, and you know, there's some kind of interesting statistics. 6 out of 10 pregnancies to women in the 20 to 24 range are unplanned and unwanted, and the goal of the project was to reduce this unplanned pregnancy amongst unmarried adults. Now, at the core of this is a website with lots of services on it. This is just one, you know, helping people select various forms of contraception. Some don't come highly recommended, like champagne cork, perhaps. I think there's a piece of string somewhere. I'm not sure what you're supposed to. Oh, there. I'm not sure what you're supposed to use that for. But anyway, it sounds very painful. But the service is only going to work if we kind of get people to engage with it. So a couple of parts of that. There was a whole series of posters rather insulting to the parenting capabilities of young men. And then this one, which is a little hard to tell from this image, but it'll be a bit more obvious for the next one when you see the prototype. This is actually this is a sticker that goes on a mirror in a women's bathroom, women's restroom, and that's the sticker, right? That's the sticker. So when you walk into the bathroom, you can get this rather uncomfortable view about what it might be like should you decide or not decide to do something. So again, you know, I mean, just the idea of using design to get people to engage with things a little bit more than they might otherwise. So these are just some of the approaches that design thinking takes and some of the kinds of projects that it's being applied to. But I'd like to go back to Brunel here and propose a possible connection as to why this is happening now, why it didn't happen, you know, 20 years ago, and why design thinking may be a useful tool. And I think that connection is a pretty simple one. It's to do with change. In times of great change, we demand new solutions, new alternatives, things that haven't existed before. It's a very simple idea. You know, Brunel worked during the height of the Industrial Revolution, when every piece of our economy and society was getting reinvented. Now, you know, many of those industrial systems from Brunel's time have run their course, and indeed they're part of the problem today in many cases. But again, we live in the midst of massive change. It's just a different kind of change driven by different kinds of technology. And that change is forcing us to question many of the fundamental components of our society, like healthcare, government, education, and security. And in periods of change, we need new ideas because our existing solutions are simply becoming obsolete because of that change. It's a very simple idea. But why design thinking? Because it changes the way that we tackle problems. Instead of focusing on our sort of defaulting to our normal convergent approach, where we make the best choice out of existing alternatives, it encourages us to diverge, to explore new ideas and create new alternatives that haven't existed before. But before we can do that, before we can diverge, before we can explore new alternatives, there's an important first step. And that first step is, what's the question we're trying to answer? In the design industry, we might call that, what's the design brief? Now, Brunel may have asked this question: how do I take a train from London to New York? He'd have had a hard time building a bridge, but he did come up with a solution. But what are the kinds of questions that we might be tackling today? Now, we're very lucky we get asked, just as you are, we're very lucky we get asked lots of really fascinating questions. We get to ask lots of fascinating questions ourselves. These are just some of them that we've been working on recently. I won't leave it up there for very long, so don't worry, you haven't got to read it. One of them in particular is a project that we've been doing with the Acumen Fund, which is a social innovation fund in New York. I'm guessing some of you know who they are, because I know you guys have a relationship with Acumen too. And on a project actually funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And this is the question: how might we improve access to safe drinking water for the world's poorest people, and at the same time stimulate innovation amongst local water providers? So instead of taking the obvious approach and having a bunch of American designers in Palo Alto come up with a bunch of new ideas that may or may not have been appropriate, we tried to take a more open, collaborative, and participative approach. So we teamed designers and investment experts up with 11 water organizations across India. And then through a series of workshops, they explored new ideas for products, services, and business models. We then hosted a competition and awarded seed funding to 5 of those organizations. And then they developed and tested and iterated on their ideas. And IDEO designers and Acumen folks we were out in India working with these organizations for several weeks, designing new social marketing campaigns, community outreach strategies, business models, new water vessels for drinking water, and new service delivery ideas. Now, some of these are just getting rolled out right now, so it's kind of early to see too much of the impact. Although in one case, there's one of the organizations is one that does large-scale, kind of village-scale water filtration plants for villages in India. And they run on a subscription service. And by redesigning the kind of community outreach strategy they had, essentially to design an event to which they invited all of the villagers, they increased their subscriptions by 4 times. So we're hoping to see many more kind of areas, sort of impact like that from these different organizations as they roll out their ideas. And we're just repeating this whole exercise in East Africa with a group of NGOs there. Now, so for me, this is an example of how far design thinking can go from tackling the kinds of small problems that I was working on at the beginning of my career. That by focusing on the needs of people, using prototypes to move ideas along quickly, getting the process out of the hands of designers, and getting the active participation of everyone in the community can be applied to more important, perhaps, bigger questions. And just like Brunel, by focusing on systems, design can have a far greater impact. So there are always areas, excuse me, areas that I'm particularly interested in asking questions about and thinking about from the perspective of a designer. And I'm just going to kind of throw out some of them now, and they may be useful start for any Q&A that we might have. So 3 that I've been thinking about quite a lot recently, and I think the world's thinking about quite a lot at the moment, at least the top 2 anyway. This whole sort of issue of reinventing health, not just in America, or where we're hearing a lot about it today, but I mean, to be honest, we don't really have sustainable healthcare systems anywhere, and so it's a pretty big problem. Encouraging sustainable consumption, I know that's something you guys care about a lot, and yet it's something that we're making pretty slow progress around. And imagining a new role for media, and one of the reasons I put this one up there is because your organization is one that has a huge role to play. You are a media organization, and I think you have a huge role to play in changing the role of media as we go forward. So on the topic of healthcare, this is one that I'm particularly interested in, which is, I believe we will only get to a sustainable healthcare system when we think of health as a life skill, not as sickness to be avoided. And a place to start, at least, is to figure out how can we start to educate kids to treat health as a life skill, to think of health as a life skill, just as we think of many other things as life skills, in order to be able to kind of manage and think about healthcare as they go through their lives. And how can technology help? How can it help get kids interested in health and give them a means to monitor their progress? I'm gonna get you upset. I'm going to use one of your competitors. So, what would a health-oriented version of Facebook look like? I'm sure there's something better than Facebook. But how might it help? How might it help build communities of kids or communities of adults to help with their own health? And how can we better illustrate the connection between nutrition, exercise, and health? There's still a lot of work to do there. On the topic of consumption, I think this is an interesting one and a difficult one, which is how are we going to create closed-loop products which do not waste and use up resources at any point, from manufacturing through use through disposal, in terms of products and services, such that we can create growth for business, because that turns out to be quite important to all of us, without extending the depletion of resources. I mean, for me, this is one of the most challenging questions that I get to ask as a designer. I mean, as an industrial designer, one of my great contributions to society is to create hundreds of thousands of tons of landfill. And I don't always feel that proud of that. I mean, I feel proud of the products that I've designed. They've been very useful to people. But in the end, that stuff has ended up in landfills. And we just simply can't continue to do that. So I think it's an important question, and we're making slow progress. We need to apply much more thought to it. And then on the topic of media, what interests me is that I think media has got itself into this kind of place where it considers itself really to be either entertainment or awareness building, right? So there's definitely an educational role. I mean, we understand that. But can media go beyond that when it comes to helping us deal with some of these kind of other pressing problems that we have to deal with? So many of these issues are going to require behavior change. They require behavior change at a mass scale. We all have to change our behaviors around health. We all have to change our behaviors around consumption. What's the role of media in helping us change our behavior? Can media companies and can media be partners to us in helping us change? What new media products and services might help with that? So, there's some of the questions many questions that I'm kind of interested in asking these days. So I'd like to believe that design thinking as one approach to innovation can actually make a difference. They can help create new ideas, new innovations that go beyond the latest products on the high street. To do that, we have to go back to this idea of thinking about design in a more expansive way, more like Brunel, less like a priesthood of professionals. And the first step is to start asking the right questions. That's all I have to say. Thank you very much. So for those of you who don't have to rush off to all the sorts of important things you have to do, then I'd be happy to take a few questions if you wish.
Hi, Tim. Thanks for coming. I have a big question. And I think you've already hinted at the answer, but I'm interested to know what your direct answer is to the question. And the question is, how would you like to save the world?
I think it would be excessive in the extreme to think that anyone could do that. But I'd like to work on these kinds of questions. We're getting more of a chance to do that. One of the things that makes me hopeful is that when we first started getting interested in working on sort of what I would broadly call kind of global questions, rather than simply how do we design the next soda bottle that a client might come and ask, or the next piece of tech that a client might come and ask. When we first started to do that, it was sort of the only way to do that was to sort of do it on the side somehow. Was to do it either in our spare time or to find somebody that had a project and we do it on the side. Then we found ourselves in the position of being able to convince some, well-funded foundations that they could start to invest in some of that stuff. And that's been great. People like Gates and Rockefeller and Kellogg and others. What's beginning to happen now is that we're finding some of our large corporate clients beginning to come, and we're able to ask them some of these questions. And they're beginning to engage in them. And I know there are some leading organizations in the world, of which this is one of them, that have been doing that for a while, but there aren't many. And we're beginning to see more, and that gives me some hope, right? Because here's the problem that I see, which is if we add up all of the innovation capacity of the world's NGOs and foundations and people that are excited about solving those problems, and compare it to all the world's capacity for doing R&D and innovation in corporations, we'd be comparing this to this, right? I mean, there are trillions of dollars spent around the world on R&D inside corporations today. If we could apply some of that to some of these problems, I think we'd make a lot more progress. So the only way we're going to do that is if we get these kinds of companies to engage. So that's something that I'm pretty excited about. So maybe that's a way that we can make a difference.
I was interested in your remark about media and its power to get people to change behavior. But it seems like media is being used to reinforce behavior or make people behave in ways that are against their own self-interest. I mean, I'm not, politically, it's a long story, but for example, like sugary soft drinks, people are bombarded with advertisements,
right.
And they just,
I mean, I think it's philosophically and politically a really challenging problem, right? Because you can go from encouraging behavior change to propaganda very, very quickly, right? There have been some actually really effective uses of media to create social change that happened in the mid-20th century in countries like Germany, and the results weren't that great, and so there is this. We're in this sort of very interesting spectrum between, yes, advertising and other forms of media that reinforce unuseful behavior, shall we say, and then propaganda at the other extreme, and we've somehow got to find something else. And I think that something else is actually not about dictating people what to do, it's about giving them appropriate choices and making the world transparent. And it's one of the reasons why I think this organization plays such an important role, is that the more we can make information transparent and the more we can help people interpret that information such that they can make good choices, the more likely they are to make those good choices, I think. But it's a really tricky, difficult problem. I don't know. Do we want to legislate away from advertising? I mean, there was actually an interesting piece on NPR this morning just about that. It's a tricky one.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, if you have people who spend their lives watching advertising or Fox News, and they believe everything they see, how do you put some other message in there?
Yeah. My own solution has been not to have TV in my house, but that helps. Okay, thank you.
You mentioned a minute ago that it seemed very promising to get these corporations engaged. And what I'm wondering about is, it sounds like you're on a cusp of from when they weren't very engaged to becoming more engaged. What have you found got them engaged? Does it always include having some way to profit from it? And I'd be interested to hear about that.
I think that's the shift that's happening. Is that I first started to see it. I get the chance to go to Davos every year, and I first started to see it there a few years ago. That more and more CEOs were starting to stand up and talk about this, talk about how they saw that things like their permission to do business in markets was going to be affected by solving some of these problems. So that was the first sign. And of course, it's one thing for CEOs to stand up and talk about it. It's another thing for corporations to do something about it. And now what I'm beginning to see is more and more companies like Unilever, like Nike, like Nokia is another example of companies that are beginning to see how their business is fundamentally going to get impacted by either not solving these problems or solving them. And corporations are self-interested organisms, right? So when they start to make that connection, even if there's no short-term profit, and it's going to be tough, and Wall Street makes it tougher because there's sort of a short-term fixation on profit makes it far harder to look out into the distance and see the time when those profits aren't going to be available. But I'm seeing more companies that have got the strength of purpose and vision to see that they need to work on these problems somehow. Now, I think one of the problems that might occur quite quickly is this sort of chaotic scrum of these organizations trying to get involved with different NGOs, and the whole thing could get to be a bit of a mess. And I think it's going to take some way of organizing that. And one of the ways I think we could start to organize that is begin to agree on some of the questions we're actually trying to answer. So that instead of everybody that wants to tackle a problem goes to ask a different question, we can actually start to apply some energy around some sort of questions that we might actually agree on. Again, it's a scale issue for me. Yeah. If we have, it doesn't matter how many of us are interested in tackling these problems, if we're all asking different questions in a very narrow way, it's very hard to tackle these big systemic problems. But if we can start to agree on what some of these questions might be, then we might be able to apply a lot more a lot more kind of capacity to solving them.
Yeah, I think a couple things that come to mind for me are the importance of the forums in which people share. Like you mentioned Davos and probably certain influential publications and all this, and media. And then the other is, I wonder, tools to help them recognize it sooner for the self-interested reasons, potentially.
Yeah.
That's
No, good point. Good point.
So I'm curious, in your experience, what kinds of behaviors and practices you've observed that get in the way of this kind of approach to problem identification and solving, and any things that you've discovered help break down those kinds of blocks and help people engage in this kind of work.
Well, it's very easy to get into the routine of just waiting for somebody to come and ask you a question, and that's that was the kind of mindset I was in for much of my career. It was like, okay, what's the next cool client going to walk through the door, and they're going to ask a question, I'm going to go solve that question for them. And it was only as I kind of, not just me, but many of my colleagues too, started to wonder, well, isn't that interesting? Either we're getting the same questions over and over again, and we've always had this problem at IDEO. I suspect you do too, but we've got severe attention deficit disorder, and so we were so excited to do the first ever laptop, and we were so excited to do the original mouse for the Lisa computer and then the Macintosh. But by the time somebody came and asked to do the third or fourth one, we just didn't want to do it. And so that's part of what sort of encourages us to start to think about asking new kinds of questions. So it's somehow moving from that reactive, just waiting for those questions to emerge to start to ask them for yourself. For me, the best way to do that is to be as observant as I can, to watch the world and look at the world and try and, often through personal experiences. So, I mean, for me, it was going to India and spending time in some of these hospitals and villages and actually seeing some of these problems firsthand, or spending time in, schools or wherever it might be. I mean, that first-hand experience has actually been an important thing for me, because it allows me to observe behaviors that kind of spark ideas off in my own head, but it just makes the importance of those questions somehow just more visceral. So, thank you.
Hi for me. Hi. You talked about taking some of this role out of the hands of designers, in fact, bringing people in to engage in these sort of activities. And also you talked about children and their kind of what they might be exposed to through, say, Facebook with more health kind of. I was wondering if you had thoughts on education and kind of roles of companies like yours and ours, and the role of kind of teaching of divergent thinking over kind of convergent thinking and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Both from your position in the industry and having been a dad.
Yeah. Well, I'm pretty convinced that all kindergartners know how to do design thinking intuitively, and we beat it out of them as they go through school. Not intentionally, but because schooling focuses so much on analytical thinking and other forms, which are valuable. I wouldn't claim that they're not valuable, but we've forgotten other forms of thinking. So we have had the opportunity to do some work in early years education and primary education. I would obviously love to see some of these very simple ideas getting kind of integrated into education, because I think kids would pick them up very easily. I mean, they're not difficult concepts. I mean, the skills that one needs to acquire in order to be a great designer in terms of visualization skills, prototyping skills, yes, they may take some while to accumulate, just like the skills in any field do. But the basic principles are pretty, very, very simple. And I think it's possible for all of us to use them in simple ways in our own lives. So I'd love to see more of them having more support within conventional primary education. And there are some places where that's happening. I mean, there are design focused charter high schools and things that are in the United States. We've been quite successful. The only thing that worries me about that is this idea that you pick people up and say, okay, you're going to go into a design school. That's what I did, right? I mean, I went to art school and spent 7 years at art school. I made that decision, but through luck, not because I knew that was the right thing for me. And a lot of people don't get to make that choice at the right moment or make the wrong choice. So I'd rather see it being integrated into more broadly into general education. And I think the UK is a place that's tried to do that with some success, not as much as it might have had. Partly again because one of the reasons why I'm interested in talking about this as a thought process rather than as a skills-based idea, although skills are important in design, is because I think that gives it some level of legitimacy when you compare it to other thought processes. And you can say, well, how does that compare to a narrative approach to thinking? How does that compare to an analytical approach to thinking? And you can start to understand the strengths and weaknesses of each. And that in fact, we may all be better off if we've got access to all of them.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks.
Hi.
Hello.
I'm really curious to hear about your creative thinking process at IDEO. So I'm really, when you have your question, I deduce it down into a pretty simple, specific question. What do you guys actually do in the creative thinking process? And particularly curious about the balance you have between people who are process experts in creativity and then domain experts, the people who actually know how the water system works in India.
Yeah, I mean, we're pretty much a community of generalists. So although people do build domain expertise over their careers, most of them don't start off that way, and we don't hire domain experts. The way we hire, we use this idea which I originally stole from McKinsey, although I think about it differently, which is this notion of hiring T-shaped people. And you've all probably heard of it, but the idea of a T-shaped person is it's somebody who's got some skill in something. And in our case, some skill in something that allows them to do something from a design perspective. So that could be as a writer, a filmmaker, an architect, or industrial designer, a business person. I mean, whatever that is, as long as it contributes to what we do, then that's fine. But we're not interested in just having specialists. What we need are people who've also got the kind of horizontal stroke of the T, which is this kind of almost sort of need to involve themselves in other parts of the process and other aspects of the process. In other things, and then more and more we have people who've got actually multiple vertical strokes to their makeup too. And the reason for that is that it used to be that design was a relatively simple idea. If I was, as an industrial designer, designing this, I can do it. I can do that on my own, pretty much. I mean, there's lots of people involved downstream. Perhaps engineering it, perhaps manufacturing it, certainly distributing it. But when it comes to kind of figuring out what a water cup might be like, or a chair, or the sort of traditional objects of design, individual designers can do that relatively well. But when we're talking about redesigning clean water systems or energy conservation or whatever else it might be working on, it's way too complex for individuals to tackle. So we need to work in teams. And at least for us, we want to work in teams which are extremely interdisciplinary and able to work very collaboratively together. In other words, I may be a designer, but I could lead the research team on a project, or maybe I'm coming up with new business models. We want people with that degree of kind of flexibility and agility. So that's why we have generalists. It's not a simple linear process, of course. It's messy, it's iterative. We ask the question, we usually re-ask it many times during the process. I mean, whatever we start with the original brief will have been re-asked and redefined and sometimes blown up and started all over again several times before we get to the end. We do rely a lot on going out into the world and trying to look at how people really behave as a source of our ideas. We do a lot of the obvious things around kind of brainstorming and other ways of coming up with ideas, and prototyping is a huge core of our culture. So people are building things all the time and finding new ways to build things, and in order to try them out, and so it's hard to describe it as a step-by-step process. It's a lot messier than it ever. I mean, if you try and describe it, it always turns out to be a lot messier. And for me, if there's one deep skill that people who practice design a lot get, it's knowing how to use the tools of the process in messy and interesting ways. And I often compare it to being a cabinet maker. A cabinet maker will know when to use a plane, when to use a chisel, when to use a piece of sandpaper. They won't necessarily use them in the same order all the time, but they know exactly the right moment. And I think that's the kind of process that design is. It's one where there are all these tools that you can use, and you've just got to pick the right moment to use them. And that's where experience, can really help.
Okay, and just a quick follow-up question. When you're selecting people to join IDEO, is there something that you've seen over and over again that you're like, yes, this is the kind of person, something that indicates that they're the kind of person who will succeed there? Well,
I mean, that whole T-shaped thing is a pretty important filter, and they're generally good storytellers because they're kind of passionate about what they do. But one of the things we've found is that it's very hard to tell from a resume who's going to make a good person at IDEO, and so we rely a lot on internships for bringing young folks into IDEO, and have historically done that, which is why we teach a lot. I mean, Stanford and other schools around the world is because that's the way we get to have 2-year-long internships with people and find great people. It's a cultural. I mean, most of our hiring process is about cultural match as much as it is about skill. I mean, it's easy enough to tell whether somebody's got the skills. It's a lot harder to tell whether somebody's got the cultural fit, and so we spend a lot more of our energy on figuring out whether somebody's got the cultural fit than skills fit.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks again for the inspirational talk. I would like to go back to the 3 questions that you raised, especially the second one, which is we should be designing closed loop systems. And I was just curious, what are the dimensions that you're thinking about when you talk about a closed loop? And just to give a very simple example, if you manufacture a bike which is made out of iron and all the different parts, it consumes a lot of material and energy. But the person who is riding it saves energy by not using fuel.
Yep.
However, the person loses productivity because it takes longer, but the person is actually using that time to exercise.
They're damnably complex,
aren't they?
I mean, it's going to take you guys to figure out how to even visualize these systems. And actually, I think that's one of the problems. Yeah. And be a fun thing to work on together would be, how do we even start to visualize these closed loop systems so that we can, because I find as a designer I can start to tinker around with things when I can visualize them. And yet, most of what we have today in terms of tools to help visualize these kinds of systems are based on life cycle analysis, which are just, they're engineering flowcharts basically, and they don't do anything for me as a designer, I'm afraid. And I compare that to kind of Hans Rosling stuff that you've got down in the lobby down there, which is a great way of visualizing, sort of change of state over time. And I think we need similar kinds of clever ways of visualizing these systems. But yeah, I mean, the reality is you've got to look at energy and materiality, and then there are social pieces to it too, and it's extremely complicated. And I suspect that we will not go from where we are to designing perfect closed loop systems in 1 leap or 10 leaps. It's going to have to be kind of an evolutionary process that goes on for quite some time. But I think we've got to start, right? Yes. And it seems to me we haven't done such a good job of starting yet.
Right. Thank you.
You mentioned the difference between telling stories and building movements, and I was curious to hear a little bit more about that and maybe some of the fundamental differences between approaching telling a story and approaching successfully building a movement.
The simplest piece of it is a movement requires participation, right? I mean, stories, traditional advertising can be consumed. You can sit in front of a TV or a computer and consume advertising. It can affect your decision, but the participation at best is when you go and buy something later. I think for movements, it will absolutely require people to participate, and I think clearly that's what Obama did so successfully, with the last election. He got people to go from consuming information about an election to actually participating in it, in really interesting ways. And so that for me is the big step, the big difference between a movement and a story.
So I guess more specifically, what characterizes, in your mind, a successful story versus a successful movement? Like, are there different fundamental?
Well, I mean, stories are controlled. One of the big challenges, I think, for corporate America today, or corporations all over the world, is this idea that they've spent the last 50 years controlling their brands and controlling the stories that get told about their brands, and producing them in such a way that other people consume them, but they can't change them. In a world of movements, that can't happen, right? You have to let go of your idea and let other people participate in it and change it and control it. So, we see lots of examples. We see lots of examples of that happening, and we see lots of examples of companies trying to prevent that happening. And they will eventually all lose. I mean, they'll eventually all of them will lose that. We'll lose that battle, and it's going to require a fundamentally different way of thinking about brands, and a fundamentally different way of thinking about how we kind of look after or steward those. I mean, the simplest vision for me was, I was always used to thinking of companies as being entities with 20-foot high billboards all the way around them, right, facing out. And I think that's the way we thought about companies for a long time, that they projected an image out into the world and were often very different on the inside. And companies like yours have kind of completely reinvented that idea, right? I mean, you're a company where its internal behavior is its brand. And a lot of the enthusiasm that people have for Google is the fact that people can look inside it to some degree anyway. And and I think that's going to be the case for all successful brands, whether they're companies or whether they're social movements like climate change. Hope that's somewhat helpful.
So what do you have to say about the American auto industry, and are they going to start to let people participate inside?
It's a sad case. I'm a bit of a car geek myself, and fortunately I've got lots of other great car companies around the world to get passionate about, because it's been hard to. It was an unbelievable kind of inability to see the future coming, actually that's not fair. I think they probably saw the future coming. They couldn't figure out what to do about it, and I'm sure it will go down as the kind of fundamental lesson in how large industries can just take themselves off the rails. I'm sure good things will bubble up out of what's left of the U.S. car industry. There will be good brands and good cars and good things that happen. But as a Brit, I've been through the decimation of the national car industry once already, and it happened. As I was a kid, I grew up near Oxford, which is one of the centres of car manufacturing in the UK. It now makes the Mini, which is pretty good, but it's owned by BMW. It's not a British car. There are no British car companies left. There are none, and at least nothing that doesn't. Nothing that doesn't hand build, a few hundred cars a year. Everything else is gone, owned by somebody else. And I suspect that we're going to see a lot of that same thing happening with the American car industry. It will look very small and very different in 10 years' time, which is kind of a sad thing. But in some way, that inevitability was probably set decades ago. We done? All right.
Thank you all for coming, and a special thank you to Tim.
Thank you.